What happens when a city built on ambition learns to live with faith? When espresso bars and family restaurants sit just blocks away from bloodstains no one speaks of? And when silence itself becomes a kind of protection, bought, sold, and enforced? On a quiet street in Templestowe, a laundry door stood slightly ajar. Behind it, 4 gunshots cracked the calm suburban air. When the echoes died, one body lay on the tiles, and with it, a fuse was lit beneath an entire city. This is Crime Cipher, where we decode the truths buried beneath myth. We don't chase glamour, we chase meaning. Because every crime leaves a fingerprint, not just on the people who commit it, but on the place that allows it to exist. Tonight, we return to Melbourne, to the narrow streets of Carlton, the scent of roasted coffee and old cigarettes, and the invisible hands that built an empire out of fear and familiarity. This isn't the story of one man or one murder. It's the anatomy of a culture, a network that made reputation its greatest weapon. This is the story of the Carlton Crew. Chapter 1. Little Italy, Unwritten Rules. In the 1970s, Carlton was Melbourne's beating heart of Italian life. Espresso machines hissed in the background, neon signs glowed in the drizzle, and the chatter of families spilled into the streets long after midnight. It looked peaceful, but behind the laughter and the tiramisu, something else was being built, a quiet order of power, stitched into favors, debts, and silence. There was no initiation, no ceremony, no headlines. Just men who knew who to call when a problem needed solving, and others who knew better than to ask how it was solved. The name Carlton Crew wasn't official. It was whispered, almost as rumor. But in time, the rumor became a fact, and the fact became a warning. They ran protection rackets that kept doors open and mouths shut. They handled gambling dens, card games, and debts that outlived their owners. To outsiders, it looked like organized chaos. But to those inside, it was a machine, efficient, quiet, and always in motion. The crew wasn't built on flash or blood. It was built on trust. Or rather, the kind of trust that comes from knowing what happens if it breaks. In a city where reputation traveled faster than the police, respect was currency, and the Carlton Crew printed its own. Chapter 2. Old Roots, New City. Melbourne's underworld didn't appear overnight. Its roots stretched back through decades of migration, poverty, and the simple human need for protection when the law felt far away. In Carlton, Fitzroy, and Brunswick, small-time hustlers grew into businessmen, and businessmen grew into fixers. The line between crime and survival blurred, and in that blur, the Carlton Crew took root. They operated where the old world met the new. From produce markets to nightclubs, from freight routes to racetracks, their influence spread through industries that kept the city moving. Some alliances formed naturally, men from the same towns, the same faiths, the same families. Others were built on necessity, fear, or profit. Officially, there were no records, no documents, no written hierarchy, but everyone in Melbourne's underworld knew the map, who handled collections, who controlled the tables, who to call when a debt needed settling. It wasn't written on paper, it was written on reputation. Every deal carried the echo of the old country, codes of respect, of family, of silence. But this was no romantic mafia fantasy. This was business, and business in Carlton moved fast. For every handshake deal, there was a ledger in someone's head. For every smile, a quiet calculation. And when those calculations failed, when someone took too much, spoke too freely, or disrespected the wrong man, the consequences came quietly, but they came all the same. Chapter 3. The Black Prince. Then came the man who turned the crew's shadows into spectacle. Alphonse Gangitano, the Black Prince of Lygon Street. He wore sharp suits, flashed sharper smiles, and carried the kind of confidence that made rooms tilt in his direction. To the public, he was an enigma, a gangster who loved the camera almost as much as he loved control. To the underworld, he was both an asset and a liability. The Black Prince didn't hide in the dark. He burned in the open. Stories about him traveled faster than truth itself. About his temper, his violence, his charm. Gangitano became the face of the Carlton Crew's reputation. He embodied its contradictions: brutal and stylish, feared and admired, unpredictable but disciplined. His rise made the crew a household name, not because they wanted attention, but because attention now had a face. And then came the night that changed everything. A quiet street, a laundry door, left slightly open. 4 gunshots. When the police arrived, they found the Black Prince dead, and with him, the illusion that the crew was untouchable. His murder didn't end the story, it ignited it. Within hours, Melbourne's criminal world began to shift. Lines blurred, alliances cracked, and the air grew thick with the scent of retaliation. The fuse had burned for years. Now it had found its spark. Chapter 4. When the city learns to duck. After Gangitano's death, Melbourne began to hold its breath. The underworld that once prided itself on quiet efficiency suddenly found itself loud, chaotic, and public. What started as isolated shootings and whispered threats turned into daylight executions. Car parks, cafes, driveways, intersections. Ordinary places became crime scenes in a heartbeat. The names filled newspapers like an obituary roll call. Moran, Williams, Veniamin, Kinniburgh, Radev. Each death pulled a new thread, and soon the whole fabric of Melbourne's underworld began to unravel. People spoke of gangland wars, but the truth was more complicated. These weren't two sides locked in battle. They were overlapping circles of business, loyalty, and betrayal, spinning until the lines disappeared. The Carlton Crew sat at the center of it all, sometimes the orchestrators, sometimes the survivors. Their reach touched gambling, drugs, and protection rackets that stretched from inner-city bars to suburban warehouses. But as bullets replaced bargains, the old rules started to break down. Fear replaced respect. Paranoia replaced silence. The city that once prided itself on knowing when to look away was now forced to look directly at the blood on its doorstep. Every shooting made the next one feel inevitable. Every headline sounded like an echo. Melbourne wasn't just watching the war, it was learning to live under it. If you've made it this far into Crime Cipher's Decode, take a second to breathe. If you value deep storytelling without the glamour, hit like. It helps this series reach others who want the full picture, not the fast headline. Chapter 5. The Restaurant Where Time Stopped. It was lunchtime in Carlton, the kind of day that looked ordinary from the outside. Families eating, waiters serving, espresso cups clinking on saucers. And then, inside one restaurant, time stopped. Andrew Benji Veniamin, once an ally and now a volatile wildcard, walked through the door where Mick Gatto was dining. The distance between them was the length of a table. Words were exchanged. Sharp, tense, final. Seconds later, a single gunshot shattered the calm. Veniamin collapsed to the floor. The story that followed divided the city. Some called it self-defense. Others called it an execution. The court saw evidence, angles, and seconds measured in frames. The streets saw something simpler. Another name added to the long, red list. Afterward, the restaurant stayed open. The same tables, the same food, the same soft music. But for those who knew, that corner of Carlton changed forever. The smell of coffee would always carry a trace of gunpowder. Veniamin's death was more than another casualty. It was a punctuation mark in a story spinning out of control. For the public, it was shocking. For the underworld, it was expected. The war had reached its midpoint, and Melbourne's most feared names were running out of places to hide. Chapter 6. The Oval, the Van, the Line You Can't Cross. Winter sunlight fell over a suburban football oval. Parents in folding chairs, kids running across green grass, laughter carried on the wind. Then came the sound that would change everything: rapid gunfire. In seconds, the laughter stopped. 2 men, Jason Moran and Pasquale Bobero, lay dead in a parked van, shot in front of dozens of witnesses, including children. It was an execution designed for message, not mystery. The war had come to the open air, to the edges of normal life. For Melbourne, this was different. The city had grown used to shadowy violence, to crimes committed in alleys and car parks. But this, a public killing in front of families, was something else. It tore through whatever illusion of control remained. The underworld was no longer beneath the surface. It had spilled into daylight. Politicians promised order. Police vowed justice. But everyone knew that no task force, no promise, could unmake what had already been unleashed. The war wasn't a storm anymore. It was weather, constant, unpredictable, and closing in. Melbourne needed a new weapon, one that didn't rely on fear or firepower. It needed an answer that could outthink the chaos. That answer came in the form of a name, Taskforce Purana. Chapter 7, Purana. Formed in the early 2000s, Taskforce Purana had one goal, to stop the killing. But that simple brief hid an impossible task. How do you dismantle a network where every suspect knows every secret? Where loyalty is both armor and trap? Purana approached the problem like a puzzle, one piece at a time. They tapped phones, followed money trails, infiltrated social circles, and turned confidants into informants. What started as surveillance became strategy. Every conversation recorded, every car tracked, every whisper noted. They didn't crash down on the underworld all at once. They squeezed it. Slowly, relentlessly, case by case, charge by charge. Some men fled. Others flipped. The rest simply vanished. And as the years passed, the funerals began to slow. The constant hum of violence that had once defined Melbourne started to fade into background noise. Taskforce Purana hadn't just caught criminals. It had changed the city's rhythm. But pressure always leaves a mark. In the quiet that followed, questions began to surface. How much power had the police taken to stop the killings? For the first time in years, Melbourne could breathe again. Chapter 8. The quiet after the gunfire. When the shooting finally slowed, Melbourne felt wrong in its own silence. The city that had learned to flinch at every loud sound now had to relearn peace. But it wasn't the same peace. It was quieter. Yes, but not calm. It was a silence that watched you. In those years, familiar faces disappeared. Some went to prison. Some went underground. Others were lowered into the earth. The pubs and cafes once filled with laughter and coded talk now held ghosts in empty booths. The Carlton Crew had ruled their streets like landlords, but the rent had come due. Mick Gatto walked free from court after being acquitted of Benji Veniamin's death, but freedom in that world came with a price: suspicion, isolation, paranoia. Survivors often become prisoners of memory. For the police, the scoreboard looked clear. The bodies stopped falling. The task force had done its job. But for the people who lived under that shadow, the families, the friends, the bystanders, the echoes never stopped. Every corner still carried a whisper of what once happened there. And that's the thing about underworld wars. They don't end when the bullets stop. They end when the city forgets. And Melbourne never really did. Chapter 9. The Lawyer Who Knew Too Much. Mario Condello was different. He wasn't a street enforcer or a foot soldier. He was a thinker, a strategist, the kind of man who turned law into a shield and opportunity into currency. A lawyer by trade, a mobster by instinct. Condello had long been suspected of being the financial brain behind some of the Carlton Crew's most sophisticated operations. Money laundering, property deals, complex webs of ownership, all executed with the elegance of a man who knew exactly how far he could push the law without breaking it. But in the underworld, knowledge is never safe. The more you know, the shorter your future. In early 2006, just days before his trial on serious charges, Condello stepped out of his home in North Brighton and never made it to his car. He was shot dead in his driveway, execution style. The message was simple: even the smartest man can't outthink fate. His murder was one of the last major hits of the Melbourne Gangland wars, closing a bloody chapter that had begun a decade earlier. With Condello's death, the line from Carlton to the city's darkest corners finally went dim. But even in death, Mario Condello's story was more than just another tally. It was proof that in Melbourne's criminal world, intelligence was no shield, it was a target. Chapter 10. The Informer. Every empire has its Judas, and Melbourne's came wearing a police badge. Years after the gunfire faded, one name shook the system harder than any bullet ever had: Nicola Gobo, also known as Lawyer X. A defense lawyer who represented many of the city's most dangerous criminals, while secretly acting as a police informant. She wasn't just feeding small details. She was handing over the pulse of the entire underworld. Strategy, client meetings, private conversations. In doing so, she helped police win convictions that reshaped Melbourne's criminal landscape. But when the truth came out, it didn't look like victory. It looked like betrayal, to justice, to ethics, to everyone who believed in due process. The Royal Commission that followed revealed a tangled mess of loyalty, manipulation, and secrecy. For the families of those convicted, it was outrage. For the police, it was damage control. For the city, it was a second reckoning, one that didn't involve bullets, but trust. The Carlton Crew was gone, but their shadow still managed to reach into the future. It reminded Melbourne that the line between criminal and lawman is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Chapter 11. The Survivors. Mick Gatto, perhaps the most recognizable face of the Carlton Crew, became a public figure, part villain, part folk hero. He gave interviews, wrote books, appeared on TV, always calm, always measured. To some, he represented the last echo of the old code: loyalty, honor, business before chaos. To others, he was just another man who had learned how to narrate his own legend. Many of the crew's associates built quiet lives. They moved into legal businesses, left the headlines behind, and tried to disappear. But the city never really let them go. Every time an anniversary came around, every time a new documentary dropped, those old names resurfaced, not as people, but as myths. The war had ended, but its survivors became its storytellers. And stories, unlike people, never die. Chapter 12. Legacy of the Crew. The Carlton Crew wasn't just a criminal syndicate. It was a mirror. It showed Melbourne what happens when loyalty turns into obsession, when business turns into blood. It showed how a city's underbelly can grow so large that it becomes impossible to hide. From the 1980s to the 2000s, the Crew's influence reached politicians, businessmen, and ordinary citizens. They shaped entire neighborhoods, not just through fear, but through money, power, and the illusion of protection. For some, they were villains. For others, they were the ones who kept chaos at bay. Their downfall came not from one betrayal, but from many: death, greed, law, and time. In the end, Melbourne's most feared crew didn't vanish in an explosion of violence. They simply ran out of men who could hold it together. The war is over, but the memory isn't. Because cities, like people, never forget the things that broke them. This is Crime Cipher, decoding the untold truths buried beneath the streets. If you want more stories that reveal what history tried to bury, subscribe and join us as we uncover the next cipher.